And a very good evening to you and a very warm welcome to Face the Nation. I'm your host this evening. I'm Faraz Shaukat Ali, and this evening we are going to be discussing the state of the nation, politically speaking, of course. We were trying to find out whether Parliament is as venal and narcissistic, all 225 members. Let's find out, shall we? And we have an excellent panel this evening, and they are Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa, who is the JVP MP from the Kalutra district. Very good evening to you, Doctor.
Good evening.
You're normally on the left, but today you're on my right.
You're right.
Indeed. Thank you very much for coming on Face the Nation. And our other guest this evening is Taraka Balasuriya, who's the UPFA MP from the Kegal district. Good evening, Taraka. And thank you very much for being on Face the Nation. And we have right here in the middle is Mr. Asoka Obesekera, who's the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Good evening, Asoka.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for being on the program. So the opening question really is all to do with the state of the nation, politically speaking. I'm going to start off with Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa and pose you all the same question, really. It's quite popular to say that the 225 members of our parliament, of which you are also part of, are all underperforming, lazy, and venal and narcissistic. Is that true?
For us, for 6 JVP members in the parliament, I can say it's not like that. We are not lazy, and we as a party, we are doing our best for the people. But this the statement you made, that shows the disappointment of the people over the whole parliament. It happens especially last 1 year or 1.5 years, because the promises the government kept in 2015 presidential election as well as general election, they failed to keep the promises. That's a problem. So for last 1 or 2 months, what we have seen, the government is failed to ensure the public security. As well, they are putting more and more burden on the people. So our debt rate increasing remarkably now. According to the 2018 central bank report, the total debt is nearly 12,000 billion Sri Lankan rupees. So the government has no option. Now they are trying to sell the public property as Eastern Terminal of Colombo Port. So that's why economically the countries fail, as well as the security-wise the countries fail. That's why people think these politicians can't ensure, or they can't keep the trust they keep on politicians during the elections. So they are seeking another options. I mean, now the discussions, dialogues start to to make government with more professionals, intellectuals, and more responsible people. That is because of, for last 7 decades, especially the ruling parties, they failed to they failed to develop the country. They failed to ensure the public security, as well. Even they failed to give the freedom and democracy to the people. So altogether, the disappointment arises from the people.
And Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa, what has the JVP been doing about the disappointment to the people? The disappointment didn't just start on the 21st of April.
Yeah.
The disappointment has started I think quite precisely, on the 27th of February 2015.
You mean after the first bond scam?
You see, even you know the date.
Yes, and and March 27, then next year.
Yeah.
Altogether. That's why. I mean, it starts just within 2 months of the presidential election, and it's keep going on. And the promise they kept on the people that against the corruption, the movement against the corruption, I mean, that is one big issue. People came disappointed over this government.
Thank you, Dr. Nalinda Jatis, for your introductory statement there. Let's go to Taraka Balasuri, the UPFA MP from the Kegol district. May I ask, Mr. Balasuri, what you have to say to my opening question?
I think there's a general tendency that people in power tend to be narcissistic. It's not necessarily with politicians. I think you can see the symbolic nature of it. If a politician walks in, somebody's carrying an umbrella, or then if a politician goes from A to B, there's a convoy of vehicle which inconvenience the other people. So there are narcissistic nature which is created by the political culture in Sri Lanka. I certainly would agree with you in that regard. But I wouldn't say that it's everybody is in that same boat. I certainly think that there are quality politicians on both sides of the divide, and there have been quality politicians in the past, and I think there will be quality politicians in the future. And I think what we as a nation should try and do is how do we bring these people up, or bring them to the forefront, and how do we create a new culture?
Mr. Balasuri, why is it then that our members of parliament, politicians, are not exactly held in good light by the majority of the public? I don't think that many parents these days would sort of be clapping for joy and lighting crackers if their children were to announce that they want to become politicians and not a doctor or some sort of professional.
Yeah, I think again, if I'm to generalize, it's not only in Sri Lanka. Everywhere in the world, the politicians are not held in very high regard. Same as cops. Again, because you are in a position of power, and then how you exercise the power. Even if you exercise the power diligently, but there's always a divide in the opinion as to, let's take a politician when he's doing well. Let's say if you have a approval rating of 50% or more, that means if other 50% of the country is opposing you. So I think people who have to take decisions, sometimes there is a political divide, and as a result, you can become very unpopular quite quickly.
And when we have traveled around the country, to mainly rural areas, we find the common theme, if you like, is that the people say that the politicians only visit them during the time of an election, meaning that politicians visit them purely to campaign for their vote, and thereafter they don't see them again until something drastic happens and somebody calls for an election.
That's not quite true. I mean, I visit my constituency every weekend. I go and meet the Saka Samiti or the village subcommittees, and all the politicians I know from UMP and also the SLFP, they have regular meeting with the party holders. But the one part of the issue is the electorate is extremely huge. Now, for example, in the Kegol district, which I represent, there are 573 Vasam, or the subdivisions, and then each Vasam has about 3 or 4 villages. So you're talking about covering 2,000, 2,500 villages. So if you even go to one village once a year. So it'll take sometimes a fairly long time to to go back to their village. So I think we also need to move ahead with times, and then we need to find technological solutions. How to contact with how to stay in touch with the electorate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tarak Balasuri, the UPF MP from the Kegal district. We'll go now to Asoka Obesekera, who's the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Mr. Obesekera, what are your observations of the state of play here, and especially the performance of our 225 members of parliament?
Well, I guess from the outset I would say that I know that the default is to be critical of the 225 members of parliament. At times I feel that the 225 members of parliament have to reflect the society in which we live. So, sometimes the people also need to take responsibility for the representatives that they have. However, I would also say that a lot of the dissatisfaction is also driven from the fact that very frequently people are never held to account. Now, we saw in October last year, as an example, there were accusations of MP bribery, and there was very, very strong evidence that seemed to support it. Some of those audio recordings that we heard, some seemed quite sort of political in nature, others seemed like the A to Z of how you bribe someone. Now, as an organization, we put together all of those recordings, actually formally filed a complaint with Siabok. I had to go in and spend some hours in Siabok recording my statement as well. But where is the accountability that emanates from it? When I say accountability, this may be about exonerating someone or finding fault with someone. But the issue is that sometimes the system is broken, and as a result, everyone just feels very frustrated, thinking that anyone can get away with anything. And I think that is one significant source of frustration in the political culture. Obviously, citizens have issues in their day-to-day lives, but in the political culture, that is a big challenge. And I mean, the statistics speak for themselves. I think on average, it takes 10.5 years for a criminal case to conclude. So if ever there was some criminal wrongdoing, you know that it takes maybe around 2 government life cycles for any kind of accountability to actually come about. And then by the time that comes about, all of the political winds have blown the other way and priorities are elsewhere, and that's considered old news. So in a way, justice must also seem to be done for people to also regain confidence in parliament. But it's not only parliamentarians there that have to take the responsibility. This is about the judicial system, many other things also needing to actually fix itself. It's not only just 225 MPs that can be blamed for every single issue, even though the public can expect a lot more.
But you can't really blame the people, because after all, the people can only vote from the same menu that is on offer. And most, if not all, the political parties continue to offer, with a little bit of exception here and there, but they continue to, the menu is the same. It's the same faces, the same people.
Well, I think also, with time, the demands and the wants of people will also change. At this moment in time, maybe someone's demand is how does a member of parliament assist their child in getting a job? In 20 years' time, with the fact that the people who are 20 years old will be 40 in 20 years' time, the needs and the way in which people are thinking will also change, and parliament and parliamentarians will also need to change the way in which they engage their public and engage the public, and that is actually something to be optimistic about. I know there's a lot of negativity about political culture, but actually with young people, as they come through the system with their aspirations and them wanting elected officials to represent their aspirations, there could be something very positive in the future.
Thank you very much, Asoka Obesekera, for your observations there. We'll come back to you. I think now let's open the floor to our journalists, and they are here. On the far end there is Shan Ranatunga. Good evening, Shan.
Good evening, Faraz.
And on this side is Deshan Gonawala.
Good evening, Faraz.
Evening, Deshan. So it's up to you.
If I can ask the first question, Dr. Nalindra Jayathis, one of the most common problems we've seen and also has been spoken about from the political stage is about the disunity between our heads of state and in the political atmosphere in general. There was a statement made by the chief incumbent of the Mihintale Rajamaha Viharya saying that nothing will get done until without unity. And if the President and Prime Minister continue to be at loggerheads with each other, and we have seen this for a long period of time, how do you as a Member of Parliament face this situation?
Yes, as you observe correctly, the disunity between the Prime Minister and President, as well as the disunity between the President and the Cabinet, now it's very obvious. So that's why most of the problems arise, especially the security problem, as well as that's why the constitutional reforms delay for such a long time, because they promised at the general election they work together, as well as the presidential election. They promised to amend the constitution, and they promised to introduce the parliamentary governance to the country. But they fail. Why? Always they try to maintain their political line, especially to strengthen their political base or the party. So if the president is able to keep his promise to change the country from the executive presidency to parliamentary government, I think this disunity, what we observed now, may not happen, because I mean the duty of the president, we kept he kept a promise on 2050 is totally the constitutional reform, not because we didn't expect more development or the other issues from this president. So even in the Select Committee of Parliament inquiring the Isandya attack, that will the information comes out now, the disunity harm the security mechanism of the country.
Dr. Jayathis, in 2014, when Maithripala Sirisena, the then General Secretary of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, came forward to support the opposition at the time and contest for the presidency against his then party chairman, the JVP was on that stage with him, if I'm not mistaken. Do you not think the JVP has a certain amount of responsibility, given you advocated for this candidate?
No, at the 2015, during the election campaign of 2015, December, November, what we said to the people, we didn't directly support to Maithripala Sirisena because we couldn't keep faith on him. That's why we asked the people, anyway we have to defeat Rajapaksa regime, but the upcoming regime, we couldn't keep the faith. So that's why our election campaign was somewhat different. Anyway, we are responsible. That's why we engage into that National Executive Council for 100 days. We tried our best to put some constitutional reforms. Actually, we were success in a certain extent. That's why we were able to introduce the 19th Amendment. But after the general election, we have only 6 seats in the parliament. So we lost our controlling power over the government. So the UPFA and the UNF formed the national government, and they did what they want.
Mr. Balasuri, if I may come to you next. Dr. Jayatissa was talking about the formation of alliances in order to defeat the previous regime. So you see an alliance forming come election time, but the moment the election is over, within a short space of time, suddenly the alliances fall apart and there's disunity, and the effect of this, we saw it happened on the 21st of April. There was pandemonium in the country. So it's the people that suffer at the hands of these alliances that form and break. Now once again we are heading to an election. What is going to happen? Are we going to see another alliance forming for the sake of an election to win votes, and then for the country to head back into the state that it's now in?
Shan, I think historically, if you look at the alliances which have been formed, they have been formed based on a certain principle. Let's say you have center of the left alliance or center of the right alliance. But the alliance which was formed in 2015 was quite unusual in it that you had, let's say, parties like the JEP, although they didn't rigidly support the alliance, a center of the left parties, and then the UMP center of the right parties coming together. Then you had other parties like the Tamil National Congress and the Muslim Congress supporting the alliance, and then also Buddhist fronts such as the Hello Rume. So I think from day one there was a spaghetti ball of ideas all mixed up together. So as I think Dr. Jayatissa said, the main intention was defeating Mahinda Rajapaksa, but not coming forward with a concrete set of policies on how to govern the country. So I think that itself, at the outset, was a mistake. So if they had developed most alliances which were formed prior to that, they were more successful because there was some sort of a basis to work on. And I think in this election, if alliances will be formed, it will be formed on more of an ideological platform than to defeat a certain candidate.
Mr. Brisekara, I want to move to you and I want to ask you now, these ideologies versus policies, these are interesting conversations, but as a voter, I'm sure you have experienced as much as we have, that the promises given are not very often the promises that are executed. There was supposed to be a curtailing of powers as per the Mahinda Chintana as well, but that didn't happen. How is it that we as a citizenry, and you working for a watchdog, how is it that we as a citizenry can have faith in the electoral process? Or how is it that we can hold these MPs accountable? I'm sure you can say next time we can vote for better people, but during the process of the governance, is there a way through which we can promote this accountability?
Well, I think accountability is a bit of a tricky thing in that it doesn't, like a light switch, it doesn't come on and off. So even when we look at things like some of the independent commissions, the challenge is that you can make something legally independent, but when you are having entire state apparatus which does not have a culture of independence, expecting those institutions to drive accountability is very, very challenging. Are you satisfied with the level of independence in these commissions at the moment as a watchdog? Well, I mean, when we see about issues connected to to corruption and holding people to account, what is the progress that we have seen? I mean, whilst we will see that the Independent Commission for Anti-Corruption, which is CIABOC, has tried to make steps on matters concerning legal reform, what the public wants to see is actual accountability. And so not a single member of parliament has been held to account on any matter connected to corruption, and so many allegations have been leveled across all sides of the political spectrum. So then the question is that it's either that everyone is clean or that the accountability mechanism doesn't work. There was a situation a few weeks ago where, especially in the immediate aftermath of the attacks,
where we had the Minister of Finance and Mass Media come and make political accusations or politicizing the tragedy. Then a few weeks ago, we had Minister Rajitha Senaratne go into a press conference and make allegations on who supposedly funded these terrorist organizations. In both situations, in the case of the Minister of Finance, there were no journalists to question him, but when Minister Rajitha Senaratne was questioned, he smiled. Is that acceptable on the part of an elected politician as a watchdog?
Yeah, I mean, I think not as a watchdog, but as a citizen, when fellow citizens have lost their lives, and to see the number of grins that were going around, I mean, I think that was sort of troubling. However, I mean, I would say that now, even when we are looking at the issues of April, we're looking at the fact that even our bureaucracy, you know, we have to sometimes look at how the incentives of our bureaucracy are structured. Sometimes you have entities which have the same mandates, not sharing information with one another. So crossing mandates, no sharing of information. So as a result, you have these silos, and everyone feels like, you know, the little fiefdom or kingdom generally of that particular ministry or department. You're just sort of serving the interests of that particular department, not a wider public service. And as a result, that's where all of this information not being shared and everything else, that's really where things crumble. So, I mean, really speaking, to sort of resolve these things, whilst we want to also point fingers at politicians, our bureaucracy has to also show that they want to reform themselves and learn from the mistakes. And I think something that is a little troubling at times is that no one really wants to acknowledge the bureaucratic, I mean, people will speak about the bureaucratic failures, but where is the roadmap for really wanting to reform bureaucratic practice, which actually led to the issues of April? Now, there may have been overarching political issues that meant that national security councils weren't properly brought together. The fact that if the attempted power grab in October, if that didn't happen, maybe the state security apparatus would have been better functioning. So politicians also have some responsibility to take. But the bureaucrats really need to ensure that these sorts of security measures and everything also function. And that's about information sharing and really looking at having a modern bureaucracy. You know, we can't just anchor ourselves in the past. We need to now look at how we innovate, how we actually protect our citizens by looking at modern techniques as opposed to just this old school way of, this is my ministry, I do things in this way, you do things in a different way. We may have similar overall aims, but we don't want to talk to each other, we don't want to share information amongst each other. That needs to end.
Dr. Jayatis, I'm not going to go deep into this because you are a member of the Parliamentary Select Committee. But since we are talking about accountability, as a member who is seated on this panel at the moment, and as somebody who is seeing these testimonies upfront and personal, do you think there is, and I know you had a protest regarding this as well, do you think there is a structural issue that is currently plaguing this country, or a political issue that is currently plaguing this country?
What I see, the structural as well as political system failure, especially. But for last 4 years, we criticize the economic policies, the development issues, as well as some, constitutional issues in the country. But we are never inquire in that public security system because we think that it will function well. But when we inquire that, the total failure from the top to bottom. Is no one responsible and no one accountable.
Why is it that the President and the Prime Minister can pass the buck to each other? Why is this happening? How is it justifiable?
It happens, not in this security issue, in all the
general,
issues we talk now. That is because of their narrow political agenda. If the president thinks that, right, I got the power for 5 years, then my duty is to ensure the well governance of the country for 5 years, then he can I mean, he would have played a better role for these 60 months. But once he got the power, he tried to establish, I mean, he tried to strengthen his party. It's totally against the will of and the intention of the parties supported by to him at the presidential election. So because of, and in other side, what Prime Minister is doing, he is trying to take that executive president post, which is never enjoy for his political career. So these political intentions, I think it harm the will of the people.
Dr. Balasuriya, before we end the first round.
Sorry, we've run out of time.
No worries.
And so we can come back to you, Deshan. We're going to take a short break. You're watching Face the Nation, and we're discussing the state of the nation in terms of politics. And welcome back to Face the Nation, and we are in conversation this evening with Asoka Obesekra, Taraka Balasuriya and Dr. Nalinda Jatissa, and we're aided ably by journalists Shayan Ranatunga and Deshan Gonamala. We've got 2 minutes each, and I thought I'll ask you, Taraka Balasuriya, whether you'd like to respond to some of the statements made by your colleague in Parliament.
Yeah, I think, I don't quite agree with Dr. Jatis's assessment that all of this, the process or the issue started because Maithripala Sirisena took the leadership of the SLFP. The formation of an independent candidate itself had faults on its own. I mean, so if you have a president without any strength in parliament, then he's a puppet. He's a presidential puppet. So then, whether the intention of Ranil Wickremesinghe, because he couldn't win elections, to put Maithripala Sirisena and then to convert him to a presidential puppet, if that was the intention, I think then that didn't work out. So I think the fact that President took certain members of the SLFP under his wing, it prevented certain issues from taking place. It didn't exaggerate the issues. So, and also I think, it's quite easy for the JVP to wash their hands saying that, we weren't either supporting them, but we were opposed to Mahinda Rajapaksas. But what we have seen during the last 4 years is that there has been a political collusion by the TNA, the JVP, the UMP, and parts of the UPFA. So that political, the collusion, I think, was the intentions were not honourable. Let's take, for example, the Constitutional Council. You had all people who supported Maithripala Sirisena representing the Constitutional Council. So is that democracy? Is that what they expected? And also I think, as a political agenda, they set about in the wrong way. If you want to come up with a change of constitution, you should do it within the first year. When you have a new government and when the new government is popular, that's where you should make the constitutional changes, not after 4 years. And with all this talk about constitutional changes, the UMP has still not put forward any what are the constitutional changes that they want. They have asked for the recommendations and ideas from the rest of the parties, and we have submitted. I have personally submitted a letter to the steering committee, which I hope that those changes can be incorporated in the constitution. But the UMP, with the most number of members in parliament, they should take ownership of this process, which they did not, and they wanted to make it look like this is a crowdsourced constitution, but it was not. You have a charade basically showing that this is a crowdsourced constitution, but actually very few people behind the closed doors, they came up with the draft. And there's also now contention whether it's a draft or it's not a draft. The Honorable Sumandiran says it's a draft. The Prime Minister says it's not a draft. So where are we? I mean, where's the openness? Where's the where's the honesty in bringing about constitutional reform? So I think, the government and the allies which supported the government all have to take blame for this process.
Thank you very much for your response, Mr. Balasuriya. Can I go to Asoka Obesekra as our sort of in-between man and ask you, what did you observe between the two opposing views?
Well, I think I can see that Dr. Jayatissa sort of in highlighting the fact that when the fracture started after January 2015, and I think one thing which is maybe missing from that discussion is the fact that the president had a very clear mandate, and I think it was really the president's responsibility to deliver on his mandate. I think the president also realized that he had his responsibilities as a party leader and his responsibilities as the national leader, and I think he finally made a decision that he needed to be the person who was not seen as the person who destabilized and demolished the SLFP. And as a consequence, I think it was very disappointing the fact that the president ended up disowning his own mandate very publicly. I mean, it's not a point of contention. He very flippantly has said that the 100-day program and everything else, which he had sort of spoken of himself, he disowned it. So I mean, the challenge there then becomes that you have a president who then disowns their own mandate, so then you're not even sure what the president is supposed to stand for. So I think that has also led to a lot of political chaos. That is not to say that the UNP and the other factions do not have some responsibility to take, and particularly when we're looking at constitutional reform. I mean, I agree with Mr. Balasuriya about the fact that you have to use the window of opportunity early on in the mandate to drive those sorts of things, and really with the Public Representations Committee going to a lot of effort trying to work overtime to get different people's views on what should be in any new constitution. The fact that a draft constitutional bill was not brought forward is an immensely disappointing, not because of the contents of the bill, but the fact that that was such an important part of this government's mandate, and the fact that no one really wants to take responsibility for not putting that forward.
Thank you, Asoka Obesekra, for your comments there. Can I go to Dr. Jayatissa? May I ask you, was this alliance between Maithripala Sirisena's group and the United National Party and the others, was it a marriage made in hell, given the fact that there were significant ideological differences? For example, the United National Party believes in a free market, an open market, whereas the other side, the SLFP, for example, they have a stated policy of hanging on to the family silver, not selling it all off. How do you marry the two together?
I don't see any significant ideological difference between two parties, because since 1977 both these parties governed the country on the basis of free market economic policy. That's why Mrs. Chandrika Kumaratunga as well as Mahinda Rajapaksa, the economic policy was the same. But what I want to say is that since 2015 August, 6 parliamentarians of JVP sit in the opposition, and always all the no confidence motions against the government we supported, and we criticize the government as well as we are holding protests over the government. And we accept Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa as the opposition leader in the parliament. But I can't understand why the group of members of joint opposition, they are always trying to force JVP towards the government, right? So,
But what do you mean by that?
I mean to strengthen the activities against the government, all the opposition parties, we have to work together, even in certain issues. But yes, as a political party with different political ideology, we are criticizing the UNF government as well as the UPFA group, I mean, by their economic policy. But in the case of against the government, I mean, we are dedicating, we are doing against all the activities against the government. But we see that they are trying to force us, and they try to paint us as a part of the government. But it's not true. And I want to highlight that Mr. Maithripala Sirisena, he was the common candidate for what? He was the common candidate to abolish the executive presidency, nothing else. He was not the common candidate to reduce the price of the drugs. He was
actually, isn't it true to say that he was actually the common candidate representing something called good governance, which...
Good governance, the good governance or well governance has, I mean, the two major parts. One, the constitutional reforms, and the other one is the anti-corruption measures. But for both issues, he failed.
Let's put this to the panel of journalists then. Failure they're talking about. They're talking about no ideological differences. But the Prime Minister, at the Presidential Commission of Inquiry, in one of the sworn statements that he made by affidavit, he alluded to the fact that the United National Party alluded or were following a system of a open market where the market would dictate the rates, and that was his partial justification for the awarding of those bonds at 12.50% when it was actually 9.85% the applicable rate. Now I open the floor to you two.
I think we should start off by letting Mr. Balasuri respond to those claims by Dr. Jayatissa.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we don't need to push any party, but we weren't born yesterday also. I think the people over the last 4 years have observed how the JVP acts. From simple things such as how they answer questions, it's like you put a full toss, and in the full toss, the first thing is they start scolding Mahinda Rajapaksa, and then after that they start scolding the government. But any responsible opposition, the main thing is to not talk about the previous government, but to talk about the present government. And also, if you see at the critical junctures, that JVP has always put their foot forward in order to save the government, such as let's say when the amendment to the Provincial Council Act was brought before Parliament. And we had an experience with the local council elections where the government used the delimitation commission in order to postpone the local council elections by 1.5 years. And if the chairman of the election commission had not threatened to have elections on elections on the councils where elections was possible, the government would not have agreed for elections for the local council elections either. With that in mind, the JVP goes and supports the provincial council elections, and then for 2.5 years, for almost 2 years, we have not had local council. We have not had provincial council elections. So now, and then even the JVP leader said that api deshapalna gemak gahanawa nang api deshapalna gemak gahanawa nang kiyanawa. And I think it's quite obvious that the government and the JVP has worked hand in glove. And let's say, for example, I'm baffled by the honourable member's comments that the whole opposition should work together. But in actuality, JVP and the TNA has wanted to take the opposition leader's position away from us when we make the largest component in the opposition. And even after when they use the argument that, well, two party, you can't have MPs from one single party being in the government and in the opposition. But when there was precedents before, there was precedents in the 100-day government. Not taking that into account, so it was legitimized. But even when the SLFP moved away from the government, JVP and the TNA, they still wanted to fight for the opposition leader's position. So why? Because you can control the Constitutional Council, because opposition leader also by law is allowed to appoint a member to the Constitutional Council. So I think to say that we are pushing them, that's not a fair accusation. I think people can very well judge how they have interacted within the last 4 years. They have seen it, and although you have an occasional protest with regard to government policies, I think whenever a critical time has come, what we have seen and what the people have seen is that they have been with the government.
Dr. Jayatis, this selective behavior or the accusation of selective behavior is something that has pertinently been raised with regard to the JVP over the last 4 years, particularly by the JO. Are the JVP selective in their criticisms? Because we saw about how certain questionable individuals were also on electoral lists and how that was pretty much swept away by the leader of your party. Had that individual been in the UNP or in the SLFP, for example, it wouldn't be the case, would it? You all would have been very vocal.
Yes, and may I answer some issues he raised before that? One thing that now he is criticizing JVP, that blaming that we are supporting UNF government, but they accept SLFP members who are the part of the government. There are I think nearly 20 cabinet and non-cabinet ministers. They joined to the opposition. They are SLFP members. We didn't fight for the opposition leader or the chief whip of the opposition post in the parliament. According to the parliament tradition, at that time, when the UNF and the UPFA went for the unity government of the national government, the TNA and the JVP were the parties who had, TNA has 16 seats and we have 6. So that's why after there are 2 major parties, UNF and UPFA. Other than that, TNA is in the 3rd position and we 4th. That's why we 2 parties took over that opposition leader and the chief of the opposition. And regarding this provincial council issue, yes, we criticize that the electoral system, especially against this monopsist method, as well as we need the responsible representatives for the votes. That's why from the beginning we are for the new electoral system. So we asked at even the local government election. Anyway, when the delimitation report submitted to the parliament, what happened that UNF, SLFP as well as the joint opposition, they voted against the delimitation report. Otherwise, I know that it has some failure points, but anyway, if we were able to pass it in the parliament, it would have been the provincial council election at least 6 months before. So it's not our failure. I mean, the UNP, SLFP as well as a joint opposition at that time, they wanted to postpone the election. So no point blaming us
I think if
on that issue.
I think there was one more question, Dr. Jayatis, sir,
Yeah.
that I asked you and you responded to Dr. Balasuriya. This is about the so-called selective attention you bring to certain issues. Is that a real thing? Is that a real problem, or is that a real action of the JVP?
If you mention the selective issues, then I can answer.
Okay.
Otherwise, I mean for the whole, yeah.
For example, the issue I raised earlier, if the SLFP or the UNP had an individual that was accused of having ties with certain questionable individuals to the level that the individual who was on the JVP national list had, would the JVP not have been very, very much more vocal?
No, that is you're asking about the member we put for the 2015
Correct.
national general election national list. Anyway, this is for the national list.
Right.
I mean, national list is totally for the non-politicians who engaged in various sectors. At that time, I mean, even intelligence didn't know the link between Ibrahim and these terrorists. I don't know at the moment.
Yeah.
They have proven it in the CID or TID. That happened. I mean, we put his name to the national list in July 2015.
Right.
That attack took place last April.
Purely on a professional level.
No, I mean, we don't have any connection with this attack, and that's why we are supporting the investigation procedure of the security forces.
Right.
But you see, in 2018 local government election, how many members of UNP, SLFP and UPFA arrested over having explosives and having contacts with ISIS? The direct accusations. But still, the Ibrahim's two sons and his one of his family member, they engage in suicidal attack. So we don't know how, I mean, the extent of his involvement in this issue.
Mr. Balasuri, I want to take it away from this for a second, and I want to come back to another accusation that's constantly thrown at the UPFA, and we are in the face of potentially looking at maybe 2 elections over the course of the next quarter or the next 2 quarters. Definitely we are going to have a presidential election. This is going to be in 2 questions. Firstly, the accusations that are persistent, the debt burden that has been put on the country, and also the fact that the Rajapaksa faction represents an authoritarian, undemocratic rule to a certain degree. What are your thoughts on this? And secondly, is the joint opposition or the SLPP-led movement going to be all about what was pre-2015? Or is there going to be a more progressive, youth-led, more dynamic movement moving forward?
Let me start answering your second question first.
Yeah.
If you were authoritarian movement or undemocratic, then we wouldn't have lost the elections. We would have won the elections. But after the third time Mahinda Rajapaksa ran for elections, he lost. So there is some form of democracy. Democracy exists in different forms. For Sri Lankans, it will be very hard to fathom that, let's say, an American who has lost a popular vote becomes the president of the country. So I think the elections from the days of from 1982, the referendum towards now has progressed for the better, barring perhaps viable elections. And I think as far as the 2019 or 2020 elections are concerned, we are certainly looking at a technocrat, not necessarily a person with a politician, but who has a political administrative abilities. So as of now, we are including a lot of the private sector members and experts, academic media in coming up with what policies would be required for the next 5-10 years. So it's definitely, I think, a forward-looking and a forward-looking set of policies which will be I think instrumental in taking us to the 21st century. And I'm sorry, what was your first question?
The first question was the accusations about debt and these persistent ones that have been alleged.
There's all this. If you look at the debt to GW ratio when Mahinda Rajapaksa started in 2004, it was at 104%, and then it was reduced to 70%. The average long term was reduced from about 3 years to about 1 year. So yes, there was debt, but you have to look at it in the context of the overall GDP. So I think there was overall better management of the debt, but certainly the debt issue, I believe that spiraled out of control from 2015 when the UMP government started defending the rupee, and then I think
they could argue that the spiraling out of control was a result of the actions of the previous government.
Yeah, but you had to come up with, anyone can argue anything, but you had to come up with numbers and say that, where has the debt to GWP ratio increased, or you have to come up with some numbers saying whether the average debt has increased, average debt rate has increased. So you need to really pinpoint and say where it is. So just accusing that it materialized during the Rajapaksa regime is just political propaganda.
Mr. Obesekara, we've heard now the differing political views. But now let's come back to the voter. You as a member of the public, also as Executive Director of Transparency International, but also firstly as a voter. There is so much information that's going out, and social media is running wild, and there's a lot of information that's passed on through things like WhatsApp and so on. From the point of view of a voter, there's a lot of confusion as to what is true and what's not. We know about fake news. How would you advise the public in this time with elections coming to take this information and to discern it correctly, to break it down accurately, and to make sense of things so that they make a decision which is correct and for the best bet for the good of the nation?
So I mean, it's this challenge around discerning information and fake news is a global problem. However, maybe the one thing that I would say, and I think it's very important, maybe looking to the future, it's sometimes also concerning the way in which, now let's say, we shut down social media. We must also realize that things like social media are there they'll be there for the long term now. So it's important also that the state uses social media as an opportunity to counter message and correct fake news as well. Now the thing is, to say that you just switch off the tap and just switch off social media, that actually creates a greater vacuum. So it's very, very important that people in public positions also take some leadership in counter messaging. One thing also that I would say is that having two sort of elected members of parliament on either side, we also have to face the ultimate fact that contesting an election is a financially illogical proposition. So we also need to start better understanding the financial interests that allow candidates to actually contest an election, because the numbers just don't add up. And the idea of having, let's say, asset disclosures of elected officials in the public domain, so that people can understand the financial position that allows someone to make the financially illogical decision of contesting an election, that is really, really important, and that just shows some degree of accountability to the public. And ultimately, accountability to the public is the only accountability mechanism which works to some degree in this country. You know, even when it comes to the Parliamentary Select Committee, the fact that it's in public is what actually ensures that the public feels a part of what's going on. Even with the Bond Commission, the fact that it was the media and others could be there is actually what really drove accountability, because the accountability mechanisms are the official state accountability mechanisms are struggling. So the idea of having that sort of information in the public is encouraging. There are 7 members of parliament that have already come forward and made their asset disclosures public. Mr. Balasuriya is one of them. And I think the one important thing is this. The 7 MPs who came forward to do that, they're not political friends. But they are people from very different political trajectories and parties and everything else. But they accept the fact that this is the step in the right direction, and the need for accountability to the public is essential. So we're hoping with the 30th of June as well, being the deadline for the next set of asset disclosures. And given the fact that there's going to be elections as well, probably before the next 30th of June, the idea of this information being in the public domain for the public to see and really understand their politicians better, that is an essential step.
How important are elections to the democratic process? And what type of negative impact has there been from delaying elections?
Well, I mean, I think elections are essential for the democratic process. Elections in and of themselves are not democracy, they're just one element of it. So the idea of having those democratic values that also come from the elections, the idea that, let's say, irrespective of changes of government, the media does not self-censor itself, as an example, those are very, very important things. And it's a responsibility of progressive-minded parliamentarians from whichever party to ensure that, let's say, media freedoms, things like that, are really championed irrespective of changes of government.
Faraz?
Yes, just before we go into a break, quick question to you, Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa. Previously, you promised to put a motion in Parliament to publicise the asset declarations. How's that doing? And are you willing yourself to follow your colleague Tariq Balasuriya and declare your assets?
Yes, we don't have any problem. Our 6 parliamentarians, we can declare our asset declarations.
When will you be doing that?
Even for last 4 declarations, we can do it. But I mean,
when will you publicize it?
We don't have anything to hide, because we are the party. We are the party put forward the very correct asset declarations to the Election Commission. That's why once
but will you publicize it?
Sorry?
Will you publicize it? Open?
We'll do it. I mean, we will do it.
When will you do that?
I mean, by end of June, we will submit our asset declaration for this year.
So that the public can see it?
Yeah,
like the other 6 or
Yes,
7
we can do
did?
it. No problem.
So you'll do that by the end of this month?
Yeah.
In a couple of weeks' time?
Yes.
Excellent. I think on that note, we'll go for...
Previous 4 declarations.
You put that out as well.
Yes.
That's splendid news. You can come on Face the Nation and do that if you like. And on that note, we'll go for a short break. You're watching Face the Nation. We're discussing the state of the nation, politically speaking, of course. And welcome back to Face the Nation. We're in conversation with our splendid guests this evening, Tariq Balasuriya, Asoka Obesekera, and Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa. You've got approximately 3 minutes each. And let's start, shall we, with you, Dr. Nalinda Jayatissa. Actually, no, let me start with Asoka Obesekera, please. Asoka, elections seem to be on most people's minds. What would you like, what does your organization like to see in place to ensure that these elections are absolutely transparent and completely above board?
So I think on one side, I think it's important that, let's say, during the nomination phase, the submission of asset disclosures and things of nominees should actually happen with the Elections Commission, and we strongly urge the Elections Commission to also support the idea of that sort of information being public. The RTI Commission themselves have given an order highlighting the fact that asset disclosures should be in the public domain, so ensuring that that is there. But beyond that, I think an important element is going to be looking at the abuse of state resources. On one side, we can see central government control with one party. Another key party controls a lot of local government. And so ensuring that state resources are not abused, be it vehicles and buildings and even staff members of state entities for political campaigns, that's going to be a key thing. And at the moment, with all of the different divisions, there is a real opportunity for that to take place. So to ensure that the public is also vigilant, filing complaints with election monitoring organizations, Transparency International Sri Lanka is one of 4, but I mean, ensuring that happens is also going to be important.
And but just whilst you're on the subject of asset declarations, what's the status on the asset declaration of the Prime Minister?
Well, it's an interesting situation where the RTI Commission has provided an order requesting the Office of the President to release the Prime Minister's asset disclosure. Yet the Office of the President refused to comply with that order and also does not seek to appeal that either. So it is one further issue which highlights the political culture where on one side His Excellency the President will call the Prime Minister corrupt, however refuses to release his asset disclosure into the public domain.
And so, Mr. Wickremesinghe hasn't been proactive and released it himself.
He has not, but I mean that asset declaration is vested in the Office of the President.
Yeah.
So, and there is an order.
There's nothing to stop the Honourable Prime Minister from being honourable if he wants to.
There's nothing to stop any member of Parliament releasing their asset disclosure, and it's encouraging to see that some already have. And ideally, hopefully, hearing the commitment from the JVP and hopefully others now, given the deadline on 30th of June, more and more of this information will be in the public domain. This is just a minimum standard. You know, we are lagging behind many others in South Asia and all of these things. This is just about getting back up to some standard, not about going beyond anything. This is just about minimum standards.
Thank you very much, Asoka Obesekera. And now Dr. Nalinda Asoka Obesekera. And now Dr. Nalinda Jatissa. Can I ask you, please, what is your stance on any forthcoming election? Let's take, let's say, the presidential election. Which party, which candidate will you be backing or not backing?
We are backing the JVP candidate. The presidential election should hold before the 8th December this year. So anyway, up to now, we try to remind the president about the mandate of 2015. As a party, we submitted the private member motion to as the 20th amendment. It needs a 2/3 majority in the parliament as well as the referendum. But now in this process is, I think it's difficult to pass the parliament as well as in the society. So we have to face the general presidential election. Now we are trying to form, and the basic discussions are going on to form the left-oriented popular movement. So we hope to, we plan to face the presidential election with our own candidate, with the policies to develop the country as well as to ensure the public security as well as the democracy. So in this time, we will not support any candidate, common or any candidate from other party. So we stand on our own vote base in upcoming the presidential election.
And who will be your candidate?
We have to discuss with other political groups, civil society organizations, and the individuals who are going to form that broad alliance. Anyway, we hope to announce it in at least in mid-August.
So are you saying that you're going to have a sort of common candidate?
Common candidate of this left progressive alliance, not the common candidate as we did in 2015, because the faith of common candidate is ruined by Maithripala Sirisena. So we will never support any common candidate out of this left progressive alliance.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nalinda Jyotis, the JVP MP for Kaluta. And finally, Mr. Taraka Balasuriya, UPF MP for the Kegol district. Tell me please, Mr. Balasuriya, what are your ideas about the next election? Shouldn't it be provincial council?
Of course it should be provincial, because that's the elections which has been postponed for 2 years. That's the elections where the government has taken the franchise away from the people for 2 years. So of course it should be provincial elections. But we don't see any likelihood that the provincial council elections will be held this year, or at least before the presidential elections. So most likely, I think the presidential elections will come first. So we are, gearing up for the presidential election, and we are confident that we can win the presidential election.
And who do you think you'll be supporting?
We of course, will be fielding our own candidate. In most likelihood, it will be Gotabaya Rajapaksa who will be the candidate as a presidential. He'll be the presidential candidate.
As the former Defence Secretary and as a man in the centre of several allegations of various things, do you think it's likely that he would comply with the plea by Transparency International that he declares his and publicizes his asset declaration beforehand?
Well, we are speculating at the moment. So
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very hopeful that he will be bringing a new culture of politics and also administration into Sri Lanka. What we have had was people with too much political experience coming in and getting bogged down into the old system, and then trying to continuing to do to carry forward the same mechanism forward. So I think everybody feels that it's time that we stir things up a little bit, and then we bring in more technocrats, we bring in more professionals, people from outside, and we should be, of course, more action oriented. We should have a vision, and we should know where we are going. We should not come just to power to defeat Ranil Wickremesinghe or Maithripala Sirisena. The people will do that, but we need to come up with a vision for a better Sri Lanka. And I think it's also we also need to realize that we are at the foothill of a fourth industrial revolution. And then today in news I was watching that 2 Sri Lankan students were instrumental in putting a satellite into the sky. And then we saw recently that Dr. Munisinghe has come up with an electric car. So in order to face the challenges such as the AI revolution which is taking place, and 3D mapping and nanotechnology and all these things, we need to leapfrog we need to leapfrog other countries if we are to become a developed country. And I think with all said and done, we need to look at economic progress. For the last 4 years, the average GDP increased only by 250 rupees. I was in the flight with the Prime Minister from Singapore, and the Prime Minister was saying that how do we make this like Sri Lanka? How do we make Sri Lanka Singapore in 10 years? Our GDP is at 4,000 levels. Singapore's GDP is at 58,000 USD levels. So we might not be able to get there, get from 4,000 to 58,000 in 10 years, but if we can at least go have a plan and make it a 10,000 GDP country, then we are making economic progress. So I think, all this democracy and all these 5-star democracies which was promised by the UMP and the JVP and, Maithripala Sirisena, never became a reality. But right now people don't have food on their table, and and there's huge amount of corruption which is taking place, which we are completely silent on, because we are talking about, we are doing, what we are doing right now is firefighting exercise, talking about the aftermaths of the April 21st. But the real issues, I think, we are neglecting at the moment, especially pertaining to corruption, which is taking place right now at this junction.
Thank you very much, Tarak Balasuriya, for your closing remarks. Although I am tempted to ask you, did you just come back on that flight with the Prime Minister and his wife?
Myself and Honourable Mujibur Rahman was sent by Parliament for
was that just a few days ago?
Yeah, for a trade.
You didn't bump into the Prime Minister in Singapore then?
No, I didn't. I didn't meet him in the flight.
Well, I can't ask you the main question then, where he went and whom he saw. But still, thank you very much. And it's the end of the program. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I hope that you have too. And thank you very much, Tarak Balasuriya, the UPFA MP from Kegol district. Thank you ever so much, Asoka Obesekera, the Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. Pleasure. And to Dr. Nalinda Jatissa, who is on my right today, but he's from the left, the JVP MP for Kalutra. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you on Newsline when you will publicize your asset declarations in conjunction with Transparency International. And last but certainly not least, to our journalists Shayan Ranatunga and Deshan Gonawala, thank you ever so much. And thank you for coming in here after a long day in the